Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Sisay Weatherlight Captain. This is a non-linear tempo deck that reads and adapts to the table at all stages of the game. It tutors up different legendary permanents at different points in the game to react to different situations or progress its game plan. It then assembles a tutor chain of creatures or planeswalkers that can combo off and win. If you like toolbox strategies, reading the table, and different outcomes every game, then this commander is for you. Without further ado, let's kick off this watery, willful, wishful way. Matt won the Mannequin Challenge and gets to start us off. Matt draws a card for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Mox Amber and passes. Zeb draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. TK draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. With a wicked turn 1 complete, Drake gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts a Talisman of Progress. He passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Zeb taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Matt a Spirit to cast Entomb. He fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos into his graveyard. The turn moves to Zeb. During its upkeep, Zeb wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Drake a Spirit to help cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. He ships the turn. TK draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Sisay. Drake takes it and TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Drake activates his Sensei's Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Drake draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts his commander, Zur the Enchanter. Drake passes to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing a Spirit as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then all creatures get -4/-4, wiping the board. Next, Matt casts Reanimate, targeting Ranger Captain of Eos in Zeb's graveyard. In response, TK casts Swan Song, targeting Reanimate. Reanimate is countered, and Matt creates a 2/2 bird. Next, Matt casts his commander, Tano, Solemn Survivor. With nothing else, Matt gives the turn to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. He taps for Forbidden Orchard, giving TK a Spirit to cast Dance of the Dead. Dance resolves and Zeb returns Ranger Captain to the battlefield tapped. Ranger Captain enters and Zeb fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. Zeb passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, TK taps his Tarnished Citadel to cast Worldly Tutor. Esper triggers and Zeb draws. In response, Matt casts Swan Song, paying the Esper tax. Tutor is countered and TK creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to TK. TK draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He taps Tarnished Citadel to help cast Catilda, Dawnheart Prime. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird and Drake with his Spirit. They both take it and TK gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and activates his Sensei's Top, rearranging the top 3. He plays a Forbidden Orchard and ships the turn. Matt draws and casts Smothering Tithe. Esper triggers and Zeb draws. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with his bird. Drake takes it and Matt ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zeb wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, Smothering Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. In his first main phase, Zeb plays a Gemstone Mine. He taps for Forbidden Orchard, giving Drake a Spirit to help cast Necropotence. In response, Drake hard casts Force of Negation. Esper triggers and Zeb draws. Tithe triggers and Matt creates a treasure. Then Force counters and exiles Necropotence. Next, Zeb casts Blind Obedience. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. All through, Zeb ships the turn. TK draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. TK casts Esper Sentinel. He taps Tarnished Citadel to help recast his commander, Sisay. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his Spirit and his bird. Zeb takes it, and TK passes the turn. Drake draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. He plays an Underground Sea for turn. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Zeb a Spirit to help recast his commander, Zur the Enchanter. Drake ships the turn. Matt draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with his bird. Drake takes it, and in his second main phase, Matt plays a Polluted Delta. He holds open mana and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zeb wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and pays for Smothering Tithe. Zeb plays a Silent Clearing and passes the turn. TK draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. TK casts Fey Burrow Elder. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Sisay. Zeb blocks with a Spirit, and TK passes to Drake. Drake draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Zur. Zur triggers, and Drake fetches up a Necropotence onto the battlefield. Matt takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake casts Helm of Awakening. Both Espers trigger, and TK and Zeb draw. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates 2 treasures. Helm resolves, and Drake activates Necropotence 25 times, paying 25 life, exiling 25 cards. He moves to his end step, and Necropotence triggers. In response, Matt cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He activates Taunos, creating a copy of a treasure and milling 2. Then Drake puts the Necro cards into his hand. Still in the end step, Drake casts Vampiric Tutor. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Drake fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He activates Sensei's Top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. Drake casts Born Upon a Wind. Born resolves, and Drake draws. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Blind Obedience. In response, Zeb activates Silent Clearing, sacking it and drawing a card. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. In response, Zeb casts Soul Partition, targeting Helm of Awakening. Blind Obedience triggers, and Zeb extorts it, with each opponent losing 1 life and Zeb gaining 3. Esper triggers, and TK draws. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. In response, Drake taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Zeb a Spirit to flash in a Wishclaw Talisman. It enters tapped through Blind Obedience, then Soul Partition exiles Helm of Awakening. Then Chain resolves, Blind Obedience is bounced, and Zeb doesn't continue the chain. Still in the instep, Drake flashes in a Mana Crypt. He flashes in a Mox Amber. He flashes in a Sensei's Divining Top. He activates Top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. He flashes in a Mystic Remora. With nothing else, Drake discards to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Matt draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with his bird. Drake takes it, and Matt passes. During his upkeep, Zeb loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. Zeb plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He recasts Blind Obedience. Esper and Remora trigger, Drake draws, Tithe triggers, Matt creates a treasure, then Zeb pays for Esper. Then Blind Obedience resolves. Next, Zeb taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Drake a Spirit to cast Leonin Relic Warder, extorting it through Blind Obedience. Since Drake is only at 1 life, he dies. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Relic Warder enters and exiles TK's Esper Sentinel. Finished up, Zeb passes to TK. TK draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. In his main phase, he plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He taps Fey Burrow Elder to help activate Sisay, fetching up Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler onto the battlefield. He activates Tyvar, untapping Fey Burrow Elder. He taps Turnus Citadel and Fey Burrow to help activate Sisay, fetching up Lavinia, Azorius Renegade onto the battlefield. He casts a Noble Hierarch. He casts a Soul Ring, paying the Esper tax. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. TK moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Hierarch's Exalted triggers, and the bird gets +1/+1. Zeb takes it, and TK ends his turn. At the end of TK's turn, Matt activates Taunos, creating a copy of his treasure and milling 2. Matt draws and knows that they are dead to TK if it gets to his turn, so he bands together with Zeb to try and find some interaction between the 2 of them. Matt moves to combat and attacks Tyvar with his bird. Tyvar takes it, and in his second main phase, Matt casts Mystic Remora. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. Tithe triggers, and Zeb pays. Remora resolves, and Matt sends the turn to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. Still in the draw step, to give Zeb another draw, Matt casts Dark Ritual. Esper triggers, and Zeb draws. Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. Dark Ritual resolves, and Matt adds 3 black. In his main phase, Zeb's Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He casts Bolus's Citadel. Remora triggers, and Matt draws. Zeb pays 8 life to help cast Hoarding Broodlord off of the top of his library through Citadel. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Unfortunately for Zeb, Lavinia triggers too. Since no mana was spent to cast the spell, Hoarding Broodlord is countered. Zeb now realizes his mistake, but knows he must keep feeding Matt to help find some sort of answer. So Zeb casts Jewel Lotus off of the top of his library through Citadel. Lavinia and Remora trigger, Matt draws, and Jewel Lotus is countered. He pays a life to cast Culling the Weak through Citadel, sacrificing a spirit as an additional cost. Remora triggers, and Matt draws. Lavinia triggers, countering Culling the Weak. With nothing else to do, Zeb passes to TK. TK draws, Tithe triggers, and Matt creates a treasure. TK taps Fey Burrow to help activate Sisay. Zeb asks Matt if he drew into anything that could help stop TK, but unfortunately Matt didn't find what he needed. Sisay's ability resolves and TK fetches up a Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, onto the battlefield. He activates Tyvar, untapping Selvala. He taps Cradle, then activates Selvala. He activates Sisay, fetching up a Derevi, Imperial Tactician, onto the battlefield tapped. Derevi enters and untaps Selvala. He activates Selvala, adding a mana to activate Sisay, fetching up an Emil the Blessed onto the battlefield. He activates Emil, flickering Derevi. Derevi enters, untapping Selvala. He activates Selvala, adding more mana. He presents a loop of flickering Derevi through Emil and then untapping Selvala when Derevi enters, adding infinite mana. He activates Sisay, fetching up a Mount Doom onto the battlefield. He presents another loop of activating Mount Doom, dealing 1 to each opponent, then flickering Derevi to untap Mount Doom. He does this over and over until the table is dead and TK wins the game. And Brandon gets to start us off. But Ashani has a pre-game action putting Leyline of the Void onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. Having learned his lesson from the last game, he casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts Paradise Mantle. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He equips Paradise Mantle to Rograk. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. Brandon then casts a Time Twister. After some moans and groans, everyone shuffles their hands and graveyards into their libraries and draws 7. Brandon casts a Mox Amber and finishes his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He ends his turn. Emma draws and plays a Scrubland. She casts Esper Sentinel. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Skirk Prospector. All through, he ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Steam Vents into play tapped. He casts Conqueror's Flail, paying for Esper. He attempts to equip Flail to Rograk, and in response, Ashani casts Vampiric Tutor. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. Then Ashani fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Flail then equips to Rograk, and with nothing else, Brandon passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Mana Crypt. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. He casts a Skull Clamp. He casts a Tangle Wire. Finished up, Ashani passes to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanents through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. She casts a Noble Hierarch and ends her turn. During Alex's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. All through, Alex ships the turn to Brandon. During Brandon's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Gemstone Mine as his land for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Brandon creates 6 treasures. He passes. During Ashani's upkeep, he removes a Fade counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He then loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Imperial Seal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Emma draws. In response, Brandon casts Swan Song, targeting Seal, paying the Esper tax. In response, Ashani casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Swan Song. In response, Brandon hard casts Force of Negation, targeting Imperial Seal. Force counters and exiles Imperial Seal, and then Blast counters Swan Song. Next, Ashani casts a Sphere of Resistance. Finished up, Ashani passes to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanents through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She ends her turn. During Alex's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws, plays a Tundra, and passes. During Brandon's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire and then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Badlands. He casts his commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. All through, Brandon passes to Ashani. During Ashani's upkeep, he removes the Fade counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and equips Skull Clamp to Rograk, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond, paying for Esper. He passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Emma taps Mana Confluence to help cast Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Emma. During Emma's upkeep, she taps her permanents through Tangle Wire. She draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She taps Mana Confluence to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Emma creates 16 treasures. She casts her commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. She activates Sisay and fetches up a Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, onto the battlefield. She activates Sisay again and fetches up a Niambi, Esteemed Speaker, onto the battlefield. Niambi triggers and Emma returns Dockside to her hand. She recasts Dockside, creating 16 more treasures. Brandon begins to regret not sacrificing his treasures as Emma activates Sisay again. She fetches up an Emil the Blessed onto the battlefield. She activates Emil, flickering Dockside. She demonstrates a loop of activating Emil to flicker Dockside, netting more treasures each time, creating infinite treasures. She activates Sisay and fetches up Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, onto the battlefield. She then activates Emil, this time targeting Sisay. Sisay flickers, Selvala triggers, and then Emma draws a card. She then demonstrates another loop of activating Emil to flicker Sisay and drawing a card through Selvala each time Sisay re-enters. She draws her deck and then casts all of her creatures. She then casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 420,069, and with a nice army at her disposal, Emma moves to combat, attacking her opponents with everything. They all take it, die, and Emma wins the game. Mike wins the You, Me, and Dupree challenge and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Snow-Covered Forest. He casts a Wild Growth on his command tower. Mike passes. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays an island. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Temple Garden into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Archon of Emeria. The table groans as they now know it's going to be one of those games, and Zach passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts a Mana Crypt. Cal passes. Mike draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Circle of Dreams Druid. Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb into play tapped through Archon. Ryan gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Archon. Mike takes it, and Zach ships the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Oswald Fiddlebender. Cal passes the turn. Mike draws and also casts his commander, Halar the Firefletcher. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays a Plains. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. Ryan gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts Xenagos the Reveler. He activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 2 red. He buys Gigantha, putting it into his hand from outside the game. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Hope of Girapur. He activates Oswald's ability, sacrificing Hope of Girapur and fetching up a Marble Diamond onto the battlefield tapped. Cal gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Xenagos with Halar. Xenagos takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 3 treasures. Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest into play tapped. He casts Persistent Petitioners. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Mike casts Beast Within, targeting Sisay. Sisay is destroyed, and Zach creates a 3/3 beast. Then Zach fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He activates Xenagos' second ability, creating a 2/2 satyr with haste. He casts Sylvan Library and gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Mirror Retriever. He activates Oswald's ability, sacrificing Mirror Retriever. Retriever triggers, and Cal returns Hope of Girapur to his hand. Then Cal fetches up a Scrap Trawler onto the battlefield. Cal passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and casts Sylvan Library. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays Cavern of Souls into play tapped, naming Advisor as it enters. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 additional through Sylvan Library, putting 2 back on top. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He casts Ral Zarek. In response, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts Counterspell, countering Ral Zarek. With nothing else, Zach passes to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Jeweled Amulet. He activates Oswald, sacrificing Jeweled Amulet, and fetches up an Expedition map onto the battlefield. He cracks his Expedition map. Scrap Trawler triggers, and Cal returns Jeweled Amulet to his hand. Then Cal fetches up a Mutavault into his hand. Cal ends his turn. During his draw step, Mike draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. In his main phase, he casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside Extortionist, and fetching up a Yisan the Wanderer Bard onto the battlefield. Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan activates his Petitioners, milling himself for 1. Ryan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns into play tapped. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He recasts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He activates Sisay, fetching up Oko, Thief of Crowns, onto the battlefield. He activates Oko's second ability, turning Mike's Halar into a 3/3 elk. Zach ships the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mutavault into play tapped. He casts Consecrate Land, targeting Mutavault. Ryan, knowing what Cal's about to do, responds by paying 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consecrate Land. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Mike casts Inscription of Abundance, having Halar and Archon fight one another. Archon dies, the table cheers, and Mike moves to his turn. During his draw step, Mike draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a War Room for turn. He activates Yisan the Wanderer Bard, getting a verse counter, and fetching up a Quirion Ranger onto the battlefield. He floats a green, then activates Quirion Ranger, returning Snow-Covered Forest to his hand, untapping Yisan. He activates Yisan, getting a verse counter, and fetches up a Scrib Ranger onto the battlefield. Then Mike taps his creature to help convoke Court of Calling, where X equals 5. In response, Ryan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies, being only 1 copy, targeting Cord. Cord is countered, and Mike passes the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan activates Petitioners, milling himself for 1. Ryan draws and transmutes Muddle the Mixture, fetching up a Pull from Tomorrow into his hand. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he plays a Plateau for turn. He activates Xenagos' first ability, adding 3 red. He casts Sneak Attack. The table looks for answers, but no one has any, and Sneak Attack resolves. Zach activates Sneak Attack, putting Jegantha onto the battlefield with haste. He taps Jegantha and activates Sisay, fetching up a Teferi Time Raveler onto the battlefield. He activates Sneak Attack, putting Bloom Tinder onto the battlefield with haste. He activates Sisay, fetching up Teferi, who slows the Sunset onto the battlefield. He taps Gaia's Cradle for 5, then activates Teferi, who slows the Sunset's first ability, untapping Gaia's Cradle, Mana Crypt, and Jegantha. He taps Jegantha and activates Sisay, fetching up Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner onto the battlefield. He activates Kiora's first ability, untapping Jegantha. He taps Jegantha and activates Sisay, fetching up Kiora, Master of Depths onto the battlefield. He floats 5 green from Cradle, then activates Kiora, Master of Depths, untapping Gaia's Cradle and Jegantha. He taps Jegantha to activate Sisay, tutoring up Gehadrone Dihada onto the battlefield. He activates Gehadrone's second ability, targeting Jegantha, putting a corruption counter on it and untapping it. He taps Jegantha to activate Sisay, fetching up a Saheeli Ray onto the battlefield. He activates Saheeli's second ability, creating a copy of Jegantha with haste, sacrificing the original. He taps Jegantha to activate Sisay, fetching up an Oath of Teferi onto the battlefield, allowing Zach to activate his Planeswalkers a second time this turn. He floats mana from Cradle, then activates Kiora, Master of Depths, untapping Jegantha and Cradle. He taps Jegantha and activates Sisay, fetching up a Chain Veil onto the battlefield. Zach presents a loop of activating Chain Veil, giving each Planeswalker an additional activated ability this turn, then using Teferi, who slows the Sunset, to untap Chain Veil, Gaia's Cradle, and Mana Crypt. With this loop, he can activate his Planeswalkers infinite times. He activates Saheeli Ray's first ability over and over, dealing damage to each opponent until they are dead, and Zach wins the game. Cal bet over on the Colts this season and gets to start us off. But Alex and Ashani both have pregame actions. Alex puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Brainstorm. Ashani puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Finehorn Elves. Cal draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Birds of Paradise and passes the turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Alex casts a turn 0 Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to his turn. Alex draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mystic Remora. Remora resolves and he gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He casts a Deathrite Shaman. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Alex draws. Ashani casts a Grim Monolith and Alex draws again. He ships the turn to Drake. Drake draws and plays an island. He casts a Lotus Petal and Alex draws through Remora. With Alex drawing so many cards, Drake tries to get in on the action by casting his own Mystic Remora. Alex's Remora triggers and he draws. Unfortunately for the table, Remora resolves. Drake passes the turn. Cal draws and casts a Drannith Magistrate. He gives the turn to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll and pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts a Talisman of Dominance and Drake draws through Remora. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Phantasmal Image, and Drake draws again. Alex taps his Talisman of Dominance to help cast Demonic Tutor. Remora triggers and Drake draws. In response, Drake casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Demonic Tutor. Remora triggers and Alex draws. With no answer, Mindbreak Trap exiles Demonic Tutor and Alex ships the turn to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn to Drake. During his upkeep, Drake pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws, plays a Wooded Foothills, and ends his turn. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Drannith. Alex takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Cal plays around the Remoras by casting Noble Hierarch. He casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. He gives the turn to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll and pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Wishclaw Talisman. Drake's Remora triggers and, in response, Drake cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Drake draws from Remora and then Wishclaw Talisman resolves. Alex bides his time and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, plays a Wooded Foothills, and ships the turn to Drake. During his upkeep, Drake pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws, casts a Chrome Mox, and Alex draws through Remora. Chrome Mox resolves, and Drake imprints Time Twister. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and casts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He passes the turn to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll and then lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Gamble. Remora triggers and Drake draws. Alex fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Cyclonic Rift. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Drake a Spirit to help cast Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Alex creates 5 treasures. He casts a Windfall and Drake draws through Remora. In response, Ashani casts Infernal Grasp, targeting Drenith, and Drake draws through Remora again. Grasp resolves, Drenith is destroyed, and Ashani loses 2 life. In response to Windfall, Drake casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Windfall. In response, Alex activates his Wishclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and then gives the Wishclaw to Cal. Then Flusterstorm resolves, countering Windfall. Next, Alex casts Underworld Breach. Remora triggers and Drake draws. Unfortunately for the table, they spent their interaction, so Breach resolves. He escapes a gamble. Remora triggers and Drake draws again. Alex fetches up a card into his hand, and with a 1 in 3 chance, he randomly discards Brain Freeze. Alex doesn't have enough cards to escape Brain Freeze, and Alex regrets letting Ashani be the one to roll. He moves to his end step, sacrifices Underworld Breach, and ships the turn to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Cal's Marsh Flats to help cast his commander, the Gitrog monster. He pays a life and cracks his Wooded Foothills. Gitrog triggers and Ashani draws. He fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts Summoner's Pact and Drake draws through Remora. Ashani fetches up a Noose Constrictor into his hand. He casts Noose Constrictor. With a discard outlet and Gitrog in play, things just got serious. He activates Constrictor, discarding Phyrexian Tower. Gitrog triggers and Ashani draws. He activates Constrictor again, discarding a swamp, and he draws through Gitrog. He plays a Bazaar of Baghdad. He activates Bazaar, drawing 2 cards and discarding Abrupt Decay, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, and Elves of Deep Shadow. Ulamog triggers and Ashani shuffles his graveyard into his library. He pays a life and cracks Prismatic Vista. Gitrog triggers and Ashani draws. He fetches up a swamp onto the battlefield. He plays a Gaia's Cradle as his Gitrog land for turn. With nothing else, and all out of gas, he ends his turn. During his upkeep, Drake lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Exploration. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Drake as it enters, which is so on flavor. He plays an island as his Exploration land for turn. He casts Walk the Aeons. In response, Alex casts Counterspell, countering Walk the Aeons. Drake's fun is stopped, and he passes the turn. At the end of Drake's turn, Cal casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Drake discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Cal. Cal draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and in response, Cal remembers to activate his Wishclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives the Wishclaw to Drake. Then Dockside enters, and Cal creates 8 treasures. He casts Emil the Blessed. In response, Ashani tries to save the table by casting Infernal Grasp, destroying Dockside Extortionist and losing 2 life. Then Emil resolves. Cal casts a Mox Amber. Cal never didn't have it and casts Luris of the Dream Den. He recasts Dockside Extortionist from his graveyard through Luris. Dockside enters and Cal creates another 8 treasures. He presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Dockside, and creating infinite treasures. He activates Sisay, fetching up Kinnan Bonder Prodigy onto the battlefield. He activates Sisay again, fetching up Lazav the Multifarious onto the battlefield. Lazav enters and Cal surveils Diabolic Intent into his graveyard. He presents a loop of activating Kinnan until he finds Thassa's Oracle, putting it onto the battlefield. Thassa's Oracle enters, and in response, he presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Lazav, and surveilling his library into his graveyard. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Cal wins the game. And Ryan gets to start us off. But Cruz has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Simeon Spirit Guide. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Cruz draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He ships the turn to John. John draws and plays a Misty Rainforest of his own. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. At the end of John's turn, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Ryan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns, which for some reason feels a lot less valuable than Cruz's. Ryan ends his turn. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Magda. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. John takes it, and in his second main phase, Cruz casts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He passes. Zach draws, plays an island, and ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, John cracks his Misty Rainforest, paying a life. In response, Zach cracks his own Misty Rainforest, paying a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Then John fetches up an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. The turn moves to John. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Ryan draws, does nothing, and moves to his end step. He discards Kitchen Imp to hand size, and the Imp's Madness ability triggers. Ryan casts Kitchen Imp for its Madness cost. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and again moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Magda and Zach with Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. They both take it, and Cruz ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He casts a Trinket Mage. In response, John cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. Then Trinket Mage enters, and Zach fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his hand. He casts Jeweled Lotus. In response, Cruz casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Lotus. Zach grumbles, then passes the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Lord Windgrace. He activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding Field of the Dead and drawing 2 cards. John ends his turn. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and moves to his end step. He discards Strength of Lunacy to hand size, and Strength of Lunacy's Madness ability triggers. Ryan casts Strength of Lunacy for its Madness cost, targeting Kitchen Imp. Having officially dubbed his only creature a Raving Lunatic, Ryan passes. Cruz draws and moves to combat. He attacks Lord Windgrace with both Magda and Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. Windgrace takes 5 and Cruz ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He ships the turn to John. During his upkeep, John loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. John draws and casts a Soul Ring. He plays a command tower for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. In response, Cruz pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Imperial Seal. In response, John casts Worldly Tutor. It resolves and he fetches up a Gitrog monster onto the top of his library. Then Misstep counters Imperial Seal. Next, John activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding Arid Mesa and drawing 2 cards. He casts the Gitrog monster. In response, Zach casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling the frog. Plans thwarted, a very sad John ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Anya Falconwrath. He activates Anya, discarding Archfiend of Spite. Anya triggers, untaps, and Ryan draws. He activates Anya again, discarding Curse of Fool's Wisdom, From Under the Floorboards, Bloodhall Priest, Alms of the Vein, Weirded Vampire, a Silent Visitor, and a Muck Drub, untapping Anya and drawing each time. Finally, having found what he was looking for, Ryan plays a Polluted Delta and then passes the turn. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Lord Windgrace with Magda and Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. John declares no blocks and Windgrace dies. Cruz passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. Zach draws and plays a mountain. With no further actions, he ships the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts a Dragon's Rage Channeler. He casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters and John fetches up a Witherbloom Apprentice into his hand. John passes. At the end of John's turn, Ryan cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. He then activates Anya, discarding City of Brass and drawing a card. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. He passes. Cruz draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and, in response to the trigger, Ryan sacrifices a treasure and adds a red. Then Cruz creates 4 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Magda. Magda triggers and Cruz creates another treasure. Zach blocks Magda with Trinket Mage and both creatures die. In his second main phase, Cruz sacrifices 7 treasures to cast Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 4. In response, Zach casts Mana Drain, countering Rocco. Cruz sighs and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, he had 7 colorless through Mana Drain. Unfortunately, he can't find a good use for it, takes no actions, and ends his turn. During his upkeep, John wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts Witherbloom Apprentice. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Imperial Recruiter as an additional cost. Witherbloom and Dragon's Rage Channeler both trigger. John surveils 1 and leaves it on top. He then gains 1 life and each of his opponents lose 1 life through Witherbloom. Then Culling the Weak resolves and John adds 4 black. He casts Abundant Growth, targeting Stomping Grounds. Channeler triggers, John surveils, leaving it on top again. Abundant Growth enters and John draws a card. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Witherbloom and Darcy both trigger. John surveils, leaves it on top, then his opponents each lose 1 life and he gains a life. In response to the Peer, Zach casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Peer into the Abyss. In response, Ryan casts Tybalt's Trickery, targeting Peer into the Abyss. Trickery counters Peer, John mills 2, and then exiles until he reveals a Utopia Sprawl, casting it, naming red as it enters. Then Narset's Reversal fizzles, much to Zach's dismay. After lamenting that he paid 7 mana for a Utopia Sprawl, John moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with a Delirious Darcy. Cruz takes 3, and John ends his turn. At the end of John's turn, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Verdant Catacombs and drawing a card. Ryan draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered mountain onto the battlefield. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Cruz. Ryan casts Imperial Seal. In response, Zach hard casts Mental Misstep, countering Seal. Ryan activates Anya, discarding World Gorger Dragon and drawing a card. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Dance of the Dead, targeting World Gorger in his graveyard. Dance resolves and World Gorger enters. World Gorger triggers and in response, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting World Gorger. All eyes stare at Ryan, who grins, but doesn't have a response. Hybridization resolves, destroying World Gorger. World Gorger's second ability triggers and Ryan floats mana. Then the second ability resolves, but there is nothing to return. Then the first ability resolves, exiling all of Ryan's permanents. Living by the dragon and dying by the dragon, Ryan sighs and uses his floating mana to cast Cloudstone Curio. Now a clean slate, Ryan ends his turn. Cruz draws and moves to combat. He attacks John with Sisay and Zach with Dockside. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Cruz activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand, and then generously giving Witchclaw back to the now destitute Ryan. Cruz plays a Verdant Catacombs for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Cruz passes. Zach draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts his commander, Niv Mizzet Parun. He ships the turn to John. During his upkeep, John loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and recasts his commander, Lord Windgrace. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, John surveils 1, putting it into the graveyard. He activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding and drawing. He plays a Dryad Arbor as his land for turn. He casts Dark Confidant. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Darcy and Witherbloom. Cruz takes it, and John ends his turn. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Cruz casts Brain Freeze, targeting himself. Niv Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage to Dark Confidant, killing it. Then Brain Freeze resolves, and Cruz mills 3. The turn moves to Cruz. Cruz draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding Flooded Strand. He casts an Ad Nauseam. Niv Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage to Cruz. Then Ad Naz resolves. Cruz reveals a Tundra, Phyrexian Metamorph, Displacer Kitten, Pact of Negation, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Scrubland, Smothering Tithe, Carpet of Flowers, Professional Facebreaker, Eladamri's Call, Badlands, Plateau, Lotus Petal, Windswept Heath, Mana Confluence, Tainted Pact, and a Demonic Consultation, deciding to stop there. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He moves to his second main phase and adds 4 blue through his carpet. He casts Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Cruz creates 6 treasures. He casts Displacer Kitten. He casts Demonic Consultation. Displacer Kitten and Niv Mizzet trigger. Zach draws, deals 1 damage to Cruz, then Displacer Kitten's trigger resolves, targeting Dockside. Dockside flickers, and Cruz creates 6 more treasures. Consultation resolves, and Cruz names Thassa's Oracle. He exiles the top 6 cards, and then exiles until he finds Oracle, which is the 3rd card from the bottom. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Cruz wins the game. Andrew wins the Sickest Playmat Challenge, just look at that thing, and gets to start us off. Andrew draws a card for turn and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts an Arbor Elf. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Exotic Orchard. Andrew passes. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. With an amazing turn 1 wrapped up, Mike passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays an island. He passes. Okami draws and plays a Nurturing Peatland. He casts a Mox Diamond. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Diamond resolves and Okami discards an Overgrown Tomb. He taps his Peatland to help cast Collector Oof. This changes a lot of players' game plan suddenly, and Okami ends his turn. Andrew draws and casts a Spectral Sailor. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Arbor Elf. Ryan takes it and Andrew passes. During his upkeep, Mike pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Confluence to help cast Noble Hierarch. He moves to combat and attacks Okami with Sisay. Noble Hierarch's Exalted triggers and Sisay gets +1/+1. Okami takes it and Mike gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an island. He passes. Okami draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He taps his Peatland to help cast Elvish Mystic. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Collector Oof. Mike takes it and Okami ships his turn. Andrew draws and moves to combat. He attacks Okami with Spectral Sailor and Ryan with Arbor Elf. They both take the hit, and with nothing else, Andrew passes. During his upkeep, Mike pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He moves to combat and attacks Okami with Sisay. Exalted triggers, and Sisay gets +1/+1. Okami takes it, and Mike passes. Ryan draws and casts a Sol Ring. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. Sol Ring resolves, and Ryan passes. Okami draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts an Arbor Elf of his own. He taps his Peatland to help cast his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Collector Oof. Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Okami passes. Andrew draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He passes. At the end of Andrew's turn, Mike casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. During his upkeep, Mike pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Okami with Sisay and Ryan with Ragavan. Okami blocks with Arbor Elf. Elf dies, Ryan takes the hit, and Ragavan triggers. In response, Andrew taps Yavimaya Coast to cast Court of Calling, where X equals 1. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. The team debates on what he would get, and they all assume it's super bad. They decide to take their chances, and Court resolves. Andrew fetches up a super bad, game-warping, devastating Birds of Paradise. Then Ragavan's trigger resolves, Ryan exiles a Lonely Sandbar off of the top of his library, and Mike creates a treasure. All through, Mike passes. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. Okami draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Elvish Mystic, Mike with Timna, and Andrew with Collector Oof. They all take it, and Okami gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays 3 and draws 3 through Timna. He plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts a Destiny Spinner. In response, Ryan casts Mana Drain. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Drain counters Destiny Spinner, and Okami follows up with a Birds of Paradise. He casts a Finehorn Elves and gives the turn to Andrew. Andrew draws and taps his Yavimaya Coast to cast his commander, Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It enters, and Andrew untaps his Birds of Paradise. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Spectral Sailor and Arbor Elf. Ryan takes it, Derevi triggers, and Andrew untaps his lands. In his second main phase, Andrew casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing his Arbor Elf. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. In response, Mike taps his Mana Confluence to flash in an Opposition Agent. In response, Andrew casts Force of Will, exiling a blue card and paying 1 life. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. Force of Will counters Opposition Agent, and Eldritch Evolution resolves. Andrew fetches up a Yisan the Wanderer Bard onto the battlefield. Andrew shifts the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Okami with Sisay. Exalted triggers, and Sisay gets +1/+1. Okami takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike taps his Mana Confluence to activate Sisay. He fetches up an Oko, Thief of Crowns, onto the battlefield. He activates Oko's second ability, turning Andrew's Yisan into a 3/3 Elk with no abilities. Next, Mike pays 3 to put his companion, Jegantha the Wellspring, into his hand. Finished up, Mike passes. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 2 colorless from his Mana Drain. He casts Deep Analysis, drawing 2 cards. He plays an island and passes the turn. Okami draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Collector Oof and Ryan with Timna. They both take it, and Okami gains 2. In his second main phase, he pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He taps his Nurturing Peatland to help cast Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Razaketh the Foul-Blooded. Everyone springs to attention, and Razaketh resolves. Okami floats mana through Elvish Mystic, then sacrifices it to Razaketh, paying 2 life and fetching up a card into his hand. He activates Razaketh, sacrificing Finehorn Elves, paying 2 life and fetching up another card into his hand. He casts a Mana Vault. He activates Razaketh, sacrificing Collector Oof, paying 2 life and fetching up another card into his hand. He casts his other commander, Kodama of the East Tree. In response, Ryan casts Wash Away, targeting Kodama. In response, Okami activates Razaketh, sacrificing Birds of Paradise, paying 2 life, and fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Veil of Summer. In response, Mike casts Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Razaketh. In response, Okami activates Razaketh, sacrificing Timna, paying 2 life, and fetching up another card into his hand. Then with nothing else, Razaketh is exiled, Veil of Summer resolves, Okami draws a card, Wash Away fizzles, and Kodama resolves. Okami casts a Mana Crypt. Kodama triggers, and he puts an Emergence Zone onto the battlefield. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Priest of Titania. He casts Survival of the Fittest, and with nothing else, Okami passes the turn. Andrew draws and casts a Spellseeker. It enters, and he fetches up a Neoform into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Derevi, Spectral Sailor, and his Elk Yisan. Ryan takes it, Derevi triggers, and Andrew untaps his Birds of Paradise and 2 lands. In his second main phase, Andrew casts Neoform, sacrificing Yisan and fetching up an Emil the Blessed onto the battlefield with a 1/1 counter through Neoform. Andrew ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He activates Oko's third ability, exchanging control of a treasure and Andrew's Derevi. He casts Jegantha the Wellspring. In response, Andrew activates Emil, flickering his Spellseeker. Spellseeker enters, and Andrew searches his library. He tries to look for an answer to Mike, but unfortunately cannot find an answer that he needs. He then fetches up a Noxious Revival into his hand, then Jegantha resolves. Mike taps his Mana Confluence to activate Sisay. He fetches up a Samut, Voice of Dissent, onto the battlefield, giving his creatures haste. Mike taps his Jegantha to activate Sisay, fetching up Najeela the Blade Blossom onto the battlefield. Mike moves to combat and attacks Ryan with everything. Najeela triggers and creates 2 warriors, tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan takes it, and Derevi triggers 6 times. Mike untaps and floats mana with Jegantha 5 times. With his final Derevi trigger, he taps down Kodama. Still in combat, he activates Sisay, fetching up Lavinia Azorius Renegade, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, and Saheeli Voice of Plenty onto the battlefield. He then activates Najeela, gaining an additional combat step. Mike presents a loop of attacking his opponents with creatures, untapping Jegantha to activate Najeela, gaining more and more combat steps, killing his opponents, and winning the game. Corey has the best old man yelling at clouds impersonation and gets to start us off. But Ryan has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Red Elemental Blast. Corey draws a card for turn and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps the City of Brass to play a turn 1, Drenith Magistrate. The rest of the table knows it's going to be one of those games, and Corey passes. Kyle draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts Deathrite Shaman. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Tybalt's Trickery. He ships the turn. Lincoln draws and starts off his turn by paying 2 life to help cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Corey. He looks at Corey's hand and draws a card. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Dispel. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Mystic Remora. He gives the turn to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt Roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Lincoln with Drenith Magistrate. Lincoln takes it, and all finished up, Corey ships his turn. Kyle draws and plays a Kaya's Cradle. He casts a Soul Ring. Mystic Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. He casts a Grim Monolith, and Lincoln draws off of Remora again. Kyle gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Dwarven Ruins into play tapped. He takes no other actions and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Lincoln casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He flashes in an Opposition Agent. The turn moves to Lincoln. During his upkeep, Lincoln pays for his Remora. He draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Opposition Agent. Ryan takes it, and with nothing else, Lincoln passes. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt Roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Short-Guy Genesis Engine. Mystic Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. In response, Lincoln casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Short-Guy. Now before you go typing in the comments, remember, Short-Guy is not a creature. It's an artifact that turns into a creature only when it's been crewed. Therefore, Force of Negation can target and counter it. Anyway, back to the game. Short-Guy is countered and exiled, and Corey returns it to the command zone. All finished up, Corey ends his turn. Kyle draws and plays a Bayou. He casts Rest in Peace. Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. Rest in Peace enters and exiles all graveyards. He ships the turn. Ryan draws, stares at Drenith Magistrate, takes no other actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Lincoln pays to keep his Remora. Lincoln draws and then immediately moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Opposition Agent. Ryan takes it, and all finished up, Lincoln ships the turn. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt Roll and takes 3 damage again. He draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast his commander, Short-Guy Genesis Engine. Mystic Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. He casts Mox Opal. Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. He gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and casts Sneak Attack. Remora triggers, and Lincoln draws. The table braces for impact, Sneak Attack resolves, but Kyle decides to bide his time. He gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, curses Corey and Drenith Magistrate, takes no other actions, passing. During his upkeep, Lincoln lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Demir's Signet. He casts a Ledger Shredder. He passes. At the end of Lincoln's turn, Corey activates Short-Guy, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a Pilot. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt Roll and takes 3 damage. Corey wonders if his Mana Crypt is faulty, and the table laughs. He draws and casts a Mana Vault. He casts Unwinding Clock. Ledger Shredder triggers, and Lincoln connives, drawing, discarding, and putting a 1/1 counter on Shredder. In response, Lincoln casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Unwinding Clock. In response, Corey casts Swan Song, targeting Force of Will. Swan Song counters Force, Lincoln creates a 2/2 bird, and Unwinding Clock resolves. Corey casts Esper Sentinel. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Skull Clamp. He activates Skull Clamp, equipping it to a pilot, killing it, and drawing 2 cards. He plays an island for turn. He activates Short-Guy, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Finished up, he gives the turn to Kyle. Corey untaps his artifacts with Kyle through Unwinding Clock. Kyle draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. At the end of Kyle's turn, Corey activates Short-Guy, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Corey untaps his artifacts with Ryan through Unwinding Clock. Ryan draws and takes no other actions, passing the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Corey activates Short-Guy, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Lincoln draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He takes no other actions and passes. At the end of Lincoln's turn, Corey flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. He activates Short-Guy. In response, Lincoln taps his Cephalid Coliseum to help flash in a Notion Thief. Notion Thief resolves, and with the Short-Guy trigger still on the stack, Corey taps his City of Brass to help flash in Dress Down. Ledger Shredder triggers, and Lincoln connives. In response, Lincoln taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Spell Pierce, targeting Dress Down. Shredder triggers, and Lincoln connives again. Spell Pierce resolves, Corey pays 2, and then Dress Down resolves. Dress Down enters, and Corey draws. Then Short-Guy's ability resolves, and Corey draws 2, discards 1, and creates a pilot. Still in the instep, with Opposition Agent temporarily shut off, Kyle cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. The turn finally moves to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey finally wins his Mana Crypt Roll. The table cheers, remembers he's the enemy, and then stops cheering. During his draw step, Corey takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He activates Skull Clamp twice, killing 2 pilots and drawing 4 cards. He casts Counterbalance. He casts Sensei's Divining Top, which is really bad with counterbalance. He activates Shorekai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Enlightened Tutor. He clamps a pilot, drawing 2 cards. All through, Corey ends his turn. At the end of Corey's turn, Dress Down is sacrificed. Kyle draws and casts a Grafdigger's Cage. Counterbalance triggers and Corey declines to reveal. Esper triggers and Kyle pays. All finished up, Kyle passes. Ryan draws and takes no other actions. He yells at some clouds and then ships his turn. Lincoln draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Notion Thief and Opposition Agent and then Corey with Ledger Shredder. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Lincoln casts Mox Diamond. Esper triggers, and since it's not an optional trigger, Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. Mox Diamond resolves, Lincoln doesn't discard a land, and then Diamond goes to the graveyard. He plays a Clearwater Pathway for turn. He casts Demonic Tutor. Ledger Shredder triggers, and Lincoln connives. Tutor resolves, he searches the top 4, puts 1 into his hand, and shuffles. He taps his Cephalid Coliseum to cast Rhystic Study. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Corey activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He then declines to flip for counterbalance, and then Rhystic Study resolves. Lincoln passes. At the end of Lincoln's turn, Corey flashes in Cathar Commando, paying for Rhystic. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. All finished up, Corey gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts Teferi, who slows the Sunset, paying for Esper and Rhystic. He activates Teferi, untapping his Soul Ring and Command Tower and gaining 2 life. Kyle gives the turn to Ryan. At the end of Kyle's turn, Corey sacrifices his Cathar Commando to destroy Rhystic Study. Still in the end step, Ryan casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Esper triggers and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. In response to Bolt, Corey casts Dovin's Veto, countering Lightning Bolt. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and starts off his turn by casting Treasonous Ogre. He pays 3 life into Treasonous Ogre, adding a red. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Lincoln. Esper Sentinel triggers and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. In response, Lincoln taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Pongify, targeting Treasonous Ogre. Esper triggers and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. In response, Ryan activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 12 life, adding 4 red. Then Ogre is destroyed and Ryan creates a 3/3 Jessica's Will then resolves and Ryan adds 5 red. He casts Jaxus, the Troublemaker. He casts Hammer of Nazan. It enters and triggers, equipping itself to Jaxus. He ships his turn. Lincoln draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He moves to combat, attacking Corey with Ledger Shredder and his bird. Corey blocks Shredder with Aven Mind Sensor and then takes the rest. In his second main phase, Lincoln casts Entomb. Esper and Counterbalance trigger. In response, Corey activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He reveals a Flusterstorm through Counterbalance, countering Entomb. Then, Esper's trigger resolves and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. Lincoln then pays 4 life to help cast Snuff Out, targeting Ryan's Ape. Shredder triggers and Lincoln connives. He casts Dark Confidant. Counterbalance triggers and Corey spins his top in response. He reveals Dramatic Reversal off of Counterbalance, countering Dark Confidant. With nothing else, Lincoln ships the turn. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and then he spins his top. He takes no other actions and passes the turn. Kyle draws and pays 3 to put Gigantha into his hand. He activates Teferi, targeting his Grim Monolith and his Bayou. He untaps both and gains 2 life. He casts Noble Hierarch. He gives the turn to Ryan. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He takes no other actions, passing the turn. Lincoln draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Ledger Shredder and his bird. Ryan takes it, and Lincoln passes. At the end of Lincoln's turn, Corey spins his top. During his upkeep, Corey once again loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Thassa's Oracle. The table suddenly comes to attention, and Corey tells him that it's just for value. No one believes him, and then Thoracle resolves. It enters, triggers, and the table braces for impact. Corey simply looks at the top 5 cards of his library, keeps 1 on top, and puts the rest on bottom. All finished up, the table breathes a sigh of relief, and Corey ends his turn. Kyle draws and casts Ral Zarek, paying the Esper tax. In response, Lincoln casts Counterspell, targeting Ral Zarek. Esper triggers, and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. Then Counterspell counters Ral. Kyle activates Teferi, targeting his Soul Ring and his Volcanic Island. He untaps both and gains 2 life. He ships the turn to Ryan. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Krark Clan Ironworks. Esper triggers and Lincoln draws through Notion Thief. Ryan gives the turn to Lincoln. Lincoln draws and casts an Arcane Signet. Esper triggers and he draws through Notion Thief. He taps his Cephalid Coliseum to help cast Windfall. Shredder and Counterbalance trigger, and in response, Corey spins the top. He then declines to reveal for Counterbalance. Still in response, Corey casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Windfall. Windfall is countered, and Lincoln moves to combat. He attacks Corey with Ledger Shredder and Ryan with his bird. Both take it, and Ryan and Corey die. All finished up, Lincoln passes. Kyle draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Gaia Drone Dihada. He activates it to gain control of Opposition Agent. Kyle activates Teferi, targeting his Soul Ring and his Volcanic Island. He untaps both and gains 2 life. He casts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He activates Sneak Attack, putting Jegantha onto the battlefield, giving it haste until the end of turn. He taps Jegantha for mana. He activates Sisay, fetching up a Teferi Time Raveler onto the battlefield. Lincoln sighs as he's now locked out of casting spells on Kyle's turn. He activates Teferi, bouncing his own Jegantha and drawing a card. He cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He activates Sneak Attack, putting Jegantha onto the battlefield, giving it haste. He floats mana through Jegantha and then activates Sisay, fetching up Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, onto the battlefield. He activates Kiora, untapping Jegantha, and activates Sisay again. He fetches up Kiora, Master of Depths, onto the battlefield. He activates Kiora, Master of Depths, untapping Jegantha. He activates Sisay, fetching up an Oath of Teferi onto the battlefield. He reactivates Kiora, Behemoth Beckoner, untapping Jegantha. He activates Sisay, fetching up the Chain Veil onto the battlefield. He activates the Chain Veil, giving all of his planeswalkers another activation this turn. He reactivates Teferi, who slows the sunset, targeting his Gaia's Cradle, Jegantha, and Chain Veil, untapping them and gaining 2 life. He activates Sisay, fetching up Saheeli Ray onto the battlefield. He activates it, scrying 1, and pinging Lincoln for 1. He presents a loop of activating the Chain Veil, reactivating Teferi, who slows the sunset, untapping Gaia's Cradle, Jegantha, and the Chain Veil for infinite Chain Veil activations. Each time he activates Saheeli Ray, pinging Lincoln until he is dead, and Kyle wins the game. Alex spun the card on his finger the longest and gets to start us off. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mystic Remora. He passes. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast Talisman of Creativity. Remora triggers and Alex draws. Brandon then taps his Talisman to cast a Mystic Remora of his own. Alex draws off of Remora and in response, not wanting to share the fun, pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Brandon's Remora. Brandon grumbles and ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts Mox Amber. Remora triggers and Alex draws. Ashani taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Trinisphere. Remora triggers and Alex draws again. Trinisphere resolves, much to the dismay of the table. All through, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Tropical Island. She passes. During his upkeep, Alex lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. The table jokes about how the game has become a burial ground, and then Alex taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Chromox, imprinting Nezahal Primal Tide. Finished up, Alex passes. Brandon draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Sol Ring. Brandon passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Black Cleave Cliffs. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Karn, the Great Creator. Alex and Brandon sigh, and Ashani activates Karn's first ability, targeting Chromox, killing it. With a commanding board state, Ashani ends his turn. Emma draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. She does nothing else and ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps Ancient Tomb and Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. He ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps Ancient Tomb and Mana Confluence to help cast his other commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets, and then gives the turn to Emma. Emma draws and plays an Underground Sea. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh Zot with Kinnan. Ashani blocks with a Thrall, and Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, glares at Ashani's board, and passes. Ashani draws and plays a Beseiju, who shelters all into play tapped. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 more Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. All through, Ashani ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws, glares at Trinisphere, and passes, discarding to hand size. Alex draws and plays an island. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Spellskite. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh Zot with Kinnan. Ashani chumps with a Thrall, and Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He passes. Ashani draws and plays a Swamp. He activates Tevesh Zot's first ability, creating 2 more Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. Slowly growing his board and now threatening Tevesh's ultimate, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws, sighs, and passes, discarding to hand size. Alex draws and plays the Yavimaya Cradle of Growth as his land for turn. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Reclamation Sage. It enters, destroying Trinisphere. Brandon and Emma cheer at possibly getting to play Magic again, and Alex moves to combat. He attacks Tevesh with Kinnan. Ashani chump blocks with a Thrall, and Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Brandon casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Chain of Vapor onto the top of his library. Brandon draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Tevesh Zot. Tevesh Zot is bounced, and Ashani does not continue the chain. All through, Brandon passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and activates Karn's first ability, targeting Lotus Petal, killing it. He taps Ancient Tomb to recast Tevesh Zot. In response, Alex hard casts Force of Negation, countering and exiling Tevesh. Ashani plays a Snow-Covered Swamp and ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and casts Rhystic Study. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Nyx Bloom Ancient. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Finished up, Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Ashani taps Boseiju, who shelters all, and pays 4 life to help cast a very painful Dismember, targeting Nyx Bloom Ancient, paying the Rhystic tax. Nyx Bloom dies, and the turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast Tevesh Sot, tapping Mana Confluence to pay for Rhystic. He activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall and drawing 2 cards. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. All through, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws and casts Noble Hierarch. She passes. Alex draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Perplexing Chimera onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh with his Reclamation Sage and Kinnan. Ashani blocks each with a Thrall, and finished up, Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. Ashani draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand. He then taps Ancient Tomb and Boseiju to help cast an uncounterable Yockelhops. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Yockelhops resolves, leaving just Karn, Tevesh Sot, and Rhystic Study on the battlefield. The table discusses for a minute and decides that they'd rather not suffer a slow and grindy death, concede, and Ashani wins the game. Zach hit the highest note at karaoke and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a snow-covered forest. He casts a Llanowar Elves. He passes. John draws and plays a Boseiju, who endures. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He casts a Llanowar Elves. All through, John ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Feed the Swarm. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Anya Falconwrath. With his engine of his deck online, Ryan ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mox Opal. He plays a Wooded Foothills. Cruz passes to Zach. Zach draws and casts Priest of Titania. He ships the turn to John. John draws and casts Tinderwall. In response, Cruz cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Then Tinderwall resolves. John plays Assault for his Springs. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts its commander, Lord Windgrace. He activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding a Lotus Field and drawing 2 cards. John passes. At the end of John's turn, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Chaos Warp and drawing a card. Ryan draws and activates Anya, discarding Violent Eruption. Anya triggers, untaps, then Ryan draws. He activates Anya again, discarding Bloodhall Priest. Anya triggers, untaps, and Ryan draws again. He activates Anya, discarding Call to the Netherworld. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan casts Call to the Netherworld for its madness cost, returning Bloodhall Priest from his graveyard to his hand. Then Anya untaps and Ryan draws. He activates Anya, discarding Biting Rain. Anya triggers, untaps, and then Ryan draws. He activates Anya, discarding Bloodhall Priest, Strength of Lunacy, Gorgon Recluse, Archfiend of Spite, and a Senseless Rage, untapping Anya each time and drawing. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Cabal Pit. He casts Shadow of the Grave. It resolves, and Ryan returns each card he discarded this turn to his hand, letting him continue this joyful sequence. Ryan activates Anya, discarding Violent Eruption, Biting Rain, Bloodhall Priest, Strength of Lunacy, Gorgon Recluse, Archfiend of Spite, Senseless Rage, and Hell Mongrel, untapping Anya and drawing each time. He activates Anya, discarding Call to the Netherworld. Anya triggers, and Ryan casts Call to the Netherworld for its madness cost, returning Archfiend of Spite to his hand. Then Anya untaps, and Ryan draws. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He activates Anya, discarding Archfiend of Spite and Blood Mad Vampire, untapping Anya and drawing each time. He plays a Luxury Suite as his land for turn. He activates Anya, discarding World Gorger Dragon and drawing a card. He casts Necromancy, targeting World Gorger Dragon. It resolves, and World Gorger Dragon enters. World Gorger triggers, and in response, Ryan cracks his Lotus Petal for a red and taps his Mox Diamond for a black. Then World Gorger's ability resolves, and Ryan exiles all of his other permanents. Necromancy triggers, and Ryan sacrifices World Gorger. World Gorger triggers, and Ryan returns all of his exiled permanents to the battlefield, including Necromancy attached to World Gorger. Ryan presents a loop of tapping his lands for mana, then exiling them and returning them untapped through the World Gorger loop. In this loop, Ryan activates Anya over and over, rummaging through his deck. Whenever he finds Alms of the Vein, he discards it through Anya and casts it for its madness cost, with each opponent losing 3 and Ryan gaining 3. He continues rummaging until he discards Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, shuffling his graveyard back into his library. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Ryan wins the game. And John gets to start us off. John draws a card for turn and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He also passes. Cruz draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He plays a Bayou for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Finished up, Cruz ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding an island. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. Zach ends his turn. John draws, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He sacrifices 3 treasures to cast his commander, Anya Falconwrath. Finished up, Ryan ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts an Arcane Signet, then passes to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Zach creates 3 treasures. All through, Zach ends his turn. John draws, mutters under his breath, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws, plays a Cabal Pit, and ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Cruz creates 6 treasures. He casts a Grim Hireling. He moves to combat and attacks John with Sisay. Before damage, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization targeting Grim Hireling. It resolves, Hireling is destroyed, and Cruz creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Then John takes the hit, and Cruz ends his turn. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Force of Will onto the top of his library. During Zach's upkeep, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Psychotic Episode. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan casts Psychotic Episode for its madness cost, targeting Zach. Episode resolves, Zach reveals a hand, and the top of his library, which is his Force of Will. Then Ryan puts Zach's Force of Will onto the bottom of his library. Then Anya untaps, and Ryan draws. Zach draws for turn, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Zach floats a colorless, then sacrifices Urza Saga, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. He plays Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet Perun. All through, Zach ends his turn. John draws, mutters a bit louder this time, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws, also takes no actions, and ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Cruz cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He uses his floating mana and sacrifices treasures to activate Sisay, fetching up Ragavan Nimble Pilferer onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Cruz. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Ragavan. John takes it, Ragavan triggers, John exiles Field of the Dead from the top of his library, and Cruz creates a treasure. All through, Cruz passes to Zach. Zach draws, and Niv-Mizzet triggers, targeting and killing Ragavan. He plays a Training Center for turn. He casts a Trinket Mage. It enters, and Zach fetches up a Grafdigger's Cage into his hand. He casts Grafdigger's Cage. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Niv-Mizzet. Before damage, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Murderous Compulsion. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan taps his Cabal Pit to help cast Murderous Compulsion for its madness cost, targeting Niv. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals 1 damage to Anya. In response, Zach casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals another damage to Anya. Offer resolves, Murderous Compulsion is countered, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Then Anya untaps, and Ryan draws. Still before damage, Ryan activates Anya again, this time discarding Dark Withering. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan casts Dark Withering for its madness cost, targeting Niv again. Zach, wondering how in the world Ryan always has it, responds by casting Mog Salvage for its alternate cost, targeting Cruz's Arcane Signet. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals 1 more damage to Anya, killing it. Then Mog Salvage resolves, and Signet is destroyed. Then Dark Withering resolves, killing Niv-Mizzet. Then Anya's ability resolves, and Ryan draws. After some bloody interaction, Zach ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Ryan casts Shadow of the Grave, returning Murderous Compulsion and Dark Withering to his hand. John draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Crucible of Worlds. After finally getting to play Magic this game, John ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He recasts his commander, Anya Falconwrath. He activates Anya, discarding Curse of Fool's Wisdom. Anya triggers, untaps, and Ryan draws. He activates Anya again, discarding Violent Eruption, Murderous Compulsion, and Dark Withering, untapping Anya and drawing each time. Ryan plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. Unable to find what he needed through his rummaging, Ryan ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Smuggler's Share. Cruz moves to combat and attacks Zach with his Frog Lizard and a 4/4 Sisay. Zach takes it all, and Cruz passes the turn. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He takes no other actions and ends his turn. John draws, sighs, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to John. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Cloudstone Curio. He casts Blazing Root Walla. It enters, Curio triggers, and Ryan returns Dockside Extortionist to his hand. He recasts Dockside, creating 7 treasures. Curio triggers, and Ryan returns Blazing Root Walla to hand. Ryan presents a loop of casting Root Walla, returning Dockside to his hand, and then casting Dockside, returning Root Walla to his hand to create infinite mana. He then casts Blazing Root Walla, now returning Anya to his hand. He casts Anya, returning Root Walla to his hand, then activates Anya, discarding and drawing a card. Ryan presents another loop of casting Blazing Root Walla, returning Anya to his hand, then casting Anya, returning Root Walla to his hand, then activating Anya, rummaging through his deck until he finds Fiery Temper. He casts Fiery Temper, then rummages through his deck again until he finds Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. He discards it through Anya, shuffling his graveyard back into his library. He repeats this process over and over until his opponents are dead, and Ryan wins the game. Drake had the highest self-esteem and gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Helm of Awakening. He casts a Talisman of Progress. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. He activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. All through, he passes. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Bloom Tender. He casts a Grim Monolith. Thanking Drake for his Helm of Awakening, Mike passes. Alana draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Underground Sea. She casts Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters, and Alana fetches up a Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer, into her hand. She casts a Mana Vault and ends her turn. Zach draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Felwar Stone. He casts a Talisman of Indulgence. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mystic Remora. Zach gives the turn to Drake. During his draw step, Drake takes the damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Godless Shrine into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast his commander, Zur the Enchanter. Finished up, Drake passes. Mike draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kennen Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Simic Signet. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He activates Kennen, looking at the top 5 and putting an Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. A bit disappointed at his flip, Mike ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. She casts Deafening Silence. Remora triggers and Zach draws. She casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. She moves to combat and attacks Zach with Ranger Captain. Zach takes it, and Alana gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts his commander, Armix, Filigree Thrasher. He passes. During his draw step, Drake takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Zur. Zur triggers, and Drake fetches up a Necropotence onto the battlefield. Then Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake activates Necropotence 12 times, paying 12 life, exiling 12 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Still in the end step, he casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Mana Vault. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Mana Vault bounces, and Drake sacrifices the land, copying the chain, targeting Deafening Silence. In response, Alana sacrifices Ranger Captain of Eos, locking out opponents from casting non-creature spells this turn. Then Deafening Silence bounces back to Alana's hand, and she doesn't continue the chain. Drake moves to cleanup, discards to hand size, and Necropotence triggers. Notably, now that Drake has moved through cleanup, Deafening Silence's ability has worn off. So in response, Drake casts Tainted Pact. Remora triggers and Zach draws again. Pact resolves and Drake exiles until he reveals a Born Upon a Wind, putting it into his hand. He taps his Talisman to cast Born Upon a Wind, and Zach draws from Remora. In response, Zach casts Pact of Negation. In response, Drake activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. With no answers, Pact counters Born, Drake exiles his discarded cards, and the turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and activates Kennen. He looks at the top 5, putting Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Zur the Enchanter. Mike passes. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Zach with Ragavan. Zach takes it, Ragavan triggers, Alana creates a treasure, and Zach exiles a Badlands off at the top of its library. In her second main phase, she casts her own Kennen Bonder Prodigy. She recasts Deafening Silence. Remora triggers and Zach draws. She casts a Favorable Elder. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Zach taps his City of Brass to cast Blue Elemental Blast, destroying Ragavan. During his upkeep, Zach's Remora and Pact of Negation go onto the stack. Zach doesn't have the mana to pay for Pact. In response, he taps his Talisman to cast Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. Everyone sighs, and Zach pays for his Pact of Negation. He then lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Armix. Armix triggers, and Zach discards Witchclaw Talisman, targeting Phantasmal Image. Image triggers, and Mike sacrifices it. Then Mike takes it, and Zach ships the turn to Drake. Drake skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Zur. Zur triggers, and Drake fetches up an Out of Time onto the battlefield. Out of Time enters, everyone untaps and faces out all of the creatures they control, then Out of Time gets 7 counters. In his second main phase, Drake casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He activates Necropotence 5 times, paying 5 life, exiling 5 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Still in his end step, he flashes in a Shimmermere. He discards the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Mike draws, does nothing, and passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Drake flashes in a Mana Vault. Alana draws and casts her commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. She passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Drake flashes in a Lotus Petal. Zach draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts his other commander, Crom Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Drake with Crom. Drake takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach taps his Mana Confluence to cast Demonic Tutor. In response, Drake casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Tutor, countering the spell. Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Drake removes a counter from Out of Time. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he taps his Talisman to help cast Laboratory Maniac. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. Crom triggers and Zach draws. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Zach. He activates Necropotence 5 times, paying 5 life, exiling 5 cards. He activates his Sensei's top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Mike draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Drake flashes in a Felwar Stone. Alana draws, also takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Drake flashes in a Dress Down, drawing a card as it enters. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Crom. Since Crom no longer has flying due to Dress Down, Drake blocks with Shimmer Mirror. In his second main phase, Zach activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Mike. Zach passes, and Dress Down is sacrificed. During his upkeep, Drake removes a counter from Out of Time. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he activates Necropotence 1 time, paying a life and exiling a card. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro card into his hand. Still in the end step, Mike flashes in an Endurance. It enters, and Zach puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library in a random order. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Endurance. Drake blocks with Laboratory Maniac. Before damage, Drake casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Zach casts Red Elemental Blast, destroying Laboratory Maniac. With Consult still in the stack, Alana casts Worldly Tutor. She fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of her library. Then Consult resolves, and Drake names Snapcaster Mage. He reveals the top 6, which contains the Snapcaster Mage, and Drake exiles his entire library. In his second main phase, Mike activates Witchclaw Talisman. In response, Drake flashes in an Opposition Agent. Crom triggers and Zach draws. In response, Mike casts Delay, targeting Agent. Agent is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it, then Witchclaw's ability resolves. Mike fetches up a card into his hand and then gives Witchclaw to Alana. Mike casts Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Alana's Sisay. With nothing else, Mike ships the turn. Alana draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Alana creates 10 treasures. She casts Aminatou the Fate Shifter. Crom triggers and Zach draws. Knowing that this is probably game over, the table thinks of a way out. So in response, Zach casts Demonic Consultation. It resolves and Zach names Otawara Soaring City. He exiles the top 6 and then exiles until he finds Otawara, putting it into his hand. He tasks Mana Confluence to channel Otawara, targeting Sisay. In response, Drake casts Silence, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Then Sisay bounces back to Alana's hand. Then Aminatou resolves. Alana activates Aminatou, flickering Dockside, creating 10 more treasures. Unfortunately locked out, Alana ends her turn. Zach draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Windfall. Windfall resolves, everyone discards their hand and draws 4. Drake attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. Out of Time leaves the battlefield and everyone's creatures phase back in. Zach moves to combat and attacks Mike with Armix and Aminatou with Crom. And before you ask, yes, he can attack with Armix because phasing allows him to. Armix triggers, Zach discards a card and targets Kinnan. In response, Mike invokes Court of Calling where X equals 3. In response, Alana activates Kinnan. She looks at the top 5, failing to find. She activates Kinnan again, failing to find. She activates Kinnan, failing to find again. She activates Kinnan, putting Ignoble Hierarch onto the battlefield. Then Alana flashes in and Urtai resurrected. Urtai enters, Court of Calling is countered, and Mike draws a card. Alana activates Kinnan one more time, putting Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, onto the battlefield. Then Armix's ability resolves, and Kinnan dies. Then Mike takes a hit, and Aminatou dies. Finished up, Zach passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Phantasmal Image onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He recasts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Crom triggers and Zach draws. Lotho triggers and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Alana cracks one of her treasures. Then Mike creates 8 treasures. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Wandering Archaic onto the battlefield. Mike ends his turn. During her draw step, Alana takes a damage from her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 4. Wandering Archaic triggers and Alana pays. In response, Zach hard casts Force of Negation, targeting Finale. Archaic triggers and Mike copies it, also targeting Finale. Force resolves and Finale is countered and exiled. Next, Alana casts Skrelv, Defector Might. Lotho triggers and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. Crom triggers and Zach draws. She recasts her commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. Finished up, Alana passes to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Crom and Mike with Armix. Armix triggers, Zach discards a card, targeting Wandering Archaic, killing it. Mike blocks Armix with Endurance and Armix dies. Then Alana takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach plays a Luxury Suite. He recasts his commander, Armix. He casts Imperial Seal. Lotho triggers, and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Zach fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. With nothing else, Zach gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Phyrexian Metamorph onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Alana cracks her treasure. Then Mike creates 8 treasures. Mike activates Kinnan, putting Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. His treasures now crack for 4 each, so Mike activates Kinnan. He puts a Spellskite onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Void Winnower onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Seaborn Muse onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur onto the battlefield. Next, Mike untaps his Grim Monolith. He taps it for 10 and then untaps it for 4. He then presents infinite colorless mana through Grim Monolith. He casts Mirage Mirror. In response, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Mirror. In response, Mike activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Birds of Paradise onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Manglehorn onto the battlefield. Manglehorn enters, destroying Skrelv. Then Fierce counters Mirage Mirror. Mike moves to his end step, Jin-Gitaxias triggers, and Mike draws 7. The turn moves to Alana. Mike untaps with Alana through Seedborn. During her upkeep, Mike taps his Grim Monolith for 10. He activates Grim Monolith to attempt to untap it. In response, Alana activates Sisay. In response, Mike attempts to untap Grim Monolith. In response, Alana attempts to activate Sisay again. In response, Mike attempts to untap Grim Monolith. With no other answers, Grim Monolith untaps. Then Mike presents infinite colorless mana with Grim Monolith. Mike activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, failing to find again. He activates Kinnan, failing to find again. He activates Kinnan a 4th time, putting Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, failing to find. He channels Boseiju, who endures, targeting Deafening Silence. Deafening Silence is destroyed, and Alana fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. Mike taps Yavimaya Coast to activate Kinnan, putting Thrasios, Triton Hero, onto the battlefield. Mike presents a loop of activating Thrasios, putting all lands onto the battlefield and the rest of his library into his hand. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Chrom triggers and Zac draws. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Endurance back to his hand. In response, Zac casts Swansong, targeting Rift. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Swansong. Tidespout triggers, targeting Zac City of Brass. Then Fierce counters Swansong, and Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing Mike's opponent's non-land permanents. With everything still in the stack, Mike flashes in an Endurance. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Alana's Bayou. Endurance enters, putting Mike's graveyard onto the bottom of his library. He casts Snap, targeting Endurance. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Alana's Tundra. Endurance bounces, and Mike untaps his Guy's Cradle and another land. Mike presents a loop of flashing in Endurance, shuffling in Snap, drawing it with Thrasios, then using Snap to bounce Endurance, and generating infinite mana. With each cast, he bounces his opponent's lands. With no board state and nothing meaningful to do, each player passes the turn back to Mike. Mike draws, presents infinite mana, and then casts all of the creatures in his deck. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals a whole bunch. He moves to combat, attacks each player with his creatures, and Mike wins the game. And Chris gets to start us off. Chris draws, plays a Tundra, and passes. Zeb draws and plays a Takenuma, Abandoned Mire. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb passes. TK draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic and ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Grim Monolith. Peter passes the turn. Chris draws and plays a Badlands. He casts his own Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Chris gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. Both Lothos trigger, both create a treasure, and Chris and Zeb each lose a life. Zeb casts Drannith Magistrate. The table immediately hates him forever, and Zeb passes to TK. TK draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He casts Simic Signet. He casts Grim Monolith. Both Lothos trigger, Chris and Zeb each lose a life and create a treasure. TK ends his turn. Peter draws and floats mana from City of Traders. He plays a Swamp for turn. City of Traders triggers and Peter sacrifices it. He pays 4 life to cast Snuff Out, killing Drannith Magistrate. He pays 6 life to cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Both Lothos trigger and Chris and Zeb lose a life and create a treasure. He pays 4 life to cast Diabolic Tutor. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He casts a Mana Crypt and passes the turn. Chris draws and casts Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. He casts his commander, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. Lothos trigger and Chris and Zeb lose a life and create a treasure. Chris ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws, plays a Bright Climb Pathway, and passes. TK draws and taps Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Felwar Stone. Lothos trigger and Chris and Zeb lose a life and create a treasure. TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Peter pays 2 life to flash in an Orcish Bowmasters. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Bowmasters enters, kills Chris's Lotho, and Peter amasses 1. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Inkmoth Nexus. He pays 4 life to cast Sidisi, Undead Vizier. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Sidisi enters, exploits his Orc army, and Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Kirik. Zeb takes it, and Peter gains 5 life. Finished up, Peter passes to Chris. Chris draws and casts Mystic Remora. He casts Dauntless Dismantler. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Sisay. Zeb takes 4 and Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Zeb casts Enlightened Tutor. Remora triggers and Zeb pays for it. In response, Chris pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Tutor. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, TK activates Kennen. He looks at the top 5, putting Spellskite onto the battlefield. TK draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and pays 4 life to help cast Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. In response, TK activates Kennen, looking at the top 5, failing to find. In response, Zeb casts Path to Exile, targeting Lavinia. Remora triggers, Chris draws, Bowmaster's triggers, kills Lotho, and Peter amasses 1. Then Path exiles Lavinia, and Chris fails to find a basic land. With Grey Merchant still on the stack, Zeb casts Ad Nauseam. Remora triggers, Chris draws, Bowmaster's triggers, pings Zeb, and amasses 1. Ad Naus resolves, and Zeb reveals a Mox Opal, Toxic Deluge, Wishclaw Talisman, Necromancy, Meathook Massacre, Plaza of Heroes, Reanimate, Demonic Tutor, Kumbal Console of Allocation, Talisman of Hierarchy, Verdant Catacombs, Springleaf Drum, Archivist of Ogma, Fracture, and then he thinks for a bit. He knows that any instance he casts right now will trigger Bowmasters and kill him, so he thinks of a way out. He decides, after a lot of deliberation, to keep going. He reveals an Eldrazi Displacer, killing him. Then Grey Merchant enters, each opponent loses 8 life, and Peter gains 16. Peter pays 4 life to cast Grim Tutor. Remora triggers, Chris draws, Bowmaster's triggers, and targets Sisay. In response, Chris casts Legolas's Quick Reflexes, untapping Sisay and giving her hexproof until the end of turn. Then Bowmaster's ability fizzles. Then Peter fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. He pays 2 life to cast Sacrifice, sacrificing CEDH as an additional cost. Kirik and Remora triggers, Chris draws, Bowmaster's triggers, pings Chris, and Peter amasses 1. Then Kirik gets a counter and Peter adds 5 black. He casts Flesh Writher. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. He pays 4 life to activate Flesh Writher's ability, sacrificing it and fetching up a Necrotic Ooze onto the battlefield. He pays 4 life to activate Flesh Writher's ability through Necrotic Ooze, sacrificing it and fetching up a Balthor the Defiled onto the battlefield. He pays 6 life to activate Balthor, exiling it and returning all black and red creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield. CEDH enters, Peter exploits Grey Merchant, fetching up a card into his hand. He pays 4 life to activate Flesh Writher, sacrificing it, fetching up Violent Tumor onto the battlefield. Violent Tumor enters, and Peter fetches up a Chainer Dementia Master into his graveyard. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Kirik. Chris takes it, and Peter gains 9 life. In his second main phase, Peter pays 9 life to activate Chainer through Necrotic Ooze, returning Grey Merchant of Asphodel to the battlefield. Grey Merchant enters, each opponent loses 12, and Peter gains 24. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing CEDH as an additional cost. Remora triggers, and Chris draws, then Peter adds 4 black. He pays 9 life to activate Chainer, returning CEDH to the battlefield. CEDH enters, Peter exploits Grey Merchant, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Dimir Houseguard. Peter presents a loop of reanimating Grey Merchant, draining the table, and sacrificing Merchant to Houseguard. He does this until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Peter won the Real Life at Home Challenge and gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays an Arid Mesa. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Orcish Bowmasters. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a turn 1 Duranath Magistrate. Finished up, Peter passes. Emma draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. She casts an Esper Sentinel. Emma passes. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Esper triggers and Emma draws. Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and evokes Fury, exiling a red card. It enters and kills Esper and Dranath. Then Fury enters and Matt sacrifices it. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Lotus Petal. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Slicer, high-speed antagonist. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Slicer. Peter takes it, and Matt converts Slicer into Slicer Hired Muscle. Matt passes. During Peter's upkeep, he gains control of Slicer. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kenrith the Return King. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Slicer. Emma takes it, and Peter ships the turn. During Emma's upkeep, she gains control of Slicer. She draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She moves to combat and attacks Mike with Slicer. Mike takes it, and Emma passes the turn. During Mike's upkeep, he gains control of Slicer. He draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Nezahal, Primal Tide. He casts his commander, Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. He pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Kenrith. He casts Mystic Remora. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Slicer. Peter takes it, and Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Gamble. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discard a Cliffhaven Kitesail, which is what he tutored for. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Slicer. Emma takes it, and Matt passes the turn. During Peter's upkeep, he gains control of Slicer. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. The table debates who Slicer should attack. Matt bargains with Peter that he should use his commander to pump Slicer and kill Mike's version of Kenrith. Mike bargains with Peter, telling him not to give in to Matt's politics and attack Emma. Emma bargains with Peter, saying that if he attacks her, she will remove Slicer. After a lot of debate, Peter moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Slicer. Mike blocks with Kenrith. Matt bargains with Peter, saying he should pump Slicer with his Kenrith. Emma and Mike bargain with Peter again, saying that he should just let Slicer die. Otherwise, they will both start attacking Peter with it. Peter agrees, and both creatures die. Peter ships the turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Emma casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Kennen. Remore triggers, and in response, Peter activates Kenrith, putting Drannith Magistrate back onto the battlefield. Then Mike draws from Remora, Kennen is exiled, and Mike gains 2 life. Still in the end step, Emma taps Mana Confluence to help cast Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers, and Mike draws again. Then Emma fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Emma. Emma draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Emma creates 6 treasures. Emma ends her turn. During his upkeep, Mike pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He casts Thrasios, Triton Hero. He passes. Matt draws, plays a Mountain, and passes the turn. At the end of Matt's turn, Peter activates Kenrith, drawing a card. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Gamble. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Misty Rainforest. He plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and in response, Emma cracks all of her treasures. She uses her floating mana to cast a Braid, targeting Mike's Soul Ring. Remora triggers, and Emma pays for it. Soul Ring is destroyed, and then Peter creates 3 treasures. He taps his Mana Confluence to help activate Kenrith's second ability, targeting his Dockside. Phantasmal Image triggers, and Peter sacrifices it. Peter gives the turn to Emma. Emma draws and taps Mana Confluence to cast an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. Emma passes. During his upkeep, Mike pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts a Manglehorn. It enters and destroys Peter's Soul Ring. Mike passes to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Mountain. He passes. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast a Smothering Tithe. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. Peter passes. Emma draws, Tithe triggers, and Peter creates a tapped treasure through Manglehorn. Emma does nothing else and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Mike pays to keep his Remora. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Peter creates a treasure. Mike does nothing and also passes the turn. Matt draws and pays for Smothering Tithe. He plays a Mishra's Workshop for turn. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kenrith. Mike takes it, and Peter passes. Emma draws, Tithe triggers, and Peter creates a treasure. She takes no actions and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Peter creates a treasure. Mike casts Tezzeret the Seeker. He activates Tezzeret's second ability where X equals 0, fetching up a Mana Crypt onto the battlefield. Mike passes. Matt draws and pays for Smothering Tithe. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to activate Kenrith, drawing a card. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Mana Crypt. He casts Mystic Remora. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kenrith. Mike takes it, and Peter passes the turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Emma casts Abrupt Decay, targeting Remora. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. Remora is destroyed, and the turn moves to Emma. Emma draws, Tithe triggers, and Peter creates a treasure. Emma channels Boseiju, who endures, targeting Smothering Tithe. In response, Peter cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He taps his Mana Confluence to activate Kenrith, drawing a card. Then Smothering Tithe is destroyed, and Peter fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates Tezzeret's second ability, fetching up a Grim Monolith onto the battlefield. He casts Void Winnower. Mike passes. Matt draws and plays a Rogue's Passage. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Matt passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He taps Mana Confluence to activate Kenrith's first ability, giving all creatures trample and haste. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Ragavan. Emma can't block due to Void Winnower, so she takes it. Ragavan triggers, Peter creates a treasure, and Emma exiles Ancient Tomb off of the top of her library. All through, Peter passes. Emma draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast Relic of Legends. Emma passes. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and floats mana for Mana Crypt. He activates Tezzeret's first ability, untapping Mana Crypt and Grim Monolith. He casts Hullbreaker Horror. He casts Simic Signet. Hullbreaker Horror triggers and targets Mana Crypt. In response, Peter activates Kenrith's last ability, targeting Phantasmal Image in his graveyard. It enters as a copy of Hullbreaker Horror. Peter then hardcasts Force of Negation, targeting Simic Signet. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Peter targets Mike's Hullbreaker Horror. Hullbreaker bounces, Simic Signet is countered and exiled, then Mana Crypt bounces back to Mike's hand. He recasts Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Void Winnower. Peter takes it, and finished up, Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Matt taps Ancient Tomb to activate Rogue's Passage, targeting Peter's Hullbreaker Horror. Phantasmal Image triggers, and Peter sacrifices it. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and moves to combat. He attacks Emma with Ragavan. Emma takes it, Ragavan triggers, Matt creates a tapped treasure, and Emma exiles a Badlands. In his second main phase, Matt plays a Blink Moth Nexus. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Peter activates Kenrith's last ability targeting Phantasmal Image in his graveyard. In response, Matt casts Firestorm, discarding 2 cards as an additional cost targeting Dockside and Manglehorn. In response, Peter cracks his Bloodstained Wire, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He activates Kenrith's second ability targeting Emma's Dockside. In response, Mike casts March of Swirling Mist, exiling a blue card targeting Dockside and Manglehorn. Both are phased out, Kenrith's ability fizzles, then Firestorm fizzles, then Peter returns Phantasmal Image to the battlefield. It enters, as a copy, a Void Winnower. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Ragavan. Emma takes it, Ragavan triggers, Peter creates a treasure, and Emma exiles a Wooded Foothills. In his second main phase, Peter casts Skirk Prospector. Peter passes. Before Emma untaps, Dockside phases back in. During Emma's upkeep, Peter activates Kenrith's second ability targeting Void Winnower. Phantasmal Image triggers and Peter sacrifices it. Still in the upkeep, Peter activates Kenrith's third ability, gaining 5 life. He taps Mana Confluence to activate Kenrith's last ability targeting Phantasmal Image in his graveyard. In response, Emma hard casts Deflecting Swat targeting Kenrith's ability. Swat resolves and Emma changes the target to Matt's Fury in his graveyard. Fury enters and Matt deals 3 to Dockside and 1 to Skirk, killing them both. Emma draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. She passes. Before Mike untaps, Manglehorn phases back in. During his upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and floats mana for Mana Crypt. He activates Tezzeret's first ability, untapping Mana Crypt and Grim Monolith. He casts Hullbreaker Horror. He casts Elvish Mystic. Hullbreaker triggers and Mike bounces Mana Crypt. He casts Mana Crypt. Hullbreaker triggers and Mike bounces Chrome Mox to his hand. He presents a loop of casting Chrome Mox and printing nothing, bouncing Mana Crypt, then recasting Mana Crypt, bouncing Chrome Mox. He creates infinite colorless mana. He activates Thrasios over and over, drawing his library and putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He activates Treasure Vault, sacrificing it, creating infinite treasures. He casts all of the creatures in his deck. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 1,000, pumping his creatures and giving them haste. He moves to combat, attacks with everything, and Mike wins the game.